Welcome to Tech Tuesday. This must be a very exciting and popular topic because yet again we have a full room, a full space. So just to repeat, my name is Veronica Farmer. I'm with Wesley Clover, who hosts Tech Tuesdays. And yes, space is one of the hottest topics right now. One of the fastest growing industrial and tech sectors globally is projected, the space industry is projected to hit $1 trillion in annual revenue in 2040. The acceleration has been fueled in part by private investment that has driven down the cost of launch and opened up access to space, which is unlocking commercial opportunity. As far back as 1962, with the launch of the Alouette satellite, Canadian innovation has played a role in understanding our universe. When we think of Canada and space, what do we think? Canada Arm? Other things? What else do we think about when we think about Canada and space? Canada Arm. Going to the moon. Excellent. So we're delighted tonight to have representatives from the Canada Aviation and Space Museum and MDA, a leader in space innovation. Up first, I'll ask Cass Marion, a science advisor for the Canada Aviation and Space Museum, to come on up and say a few words about the museum.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm going to attempt to put this in here. Can everyone hear me all right? I'm a hand talker, so I'll have to put this down. All right. Thank you so much, Veronica and Wesley Clover, for allowing me to come and say a few words before Ian takes the stage. So as she mentioned, I'm probably one of the only scientists in the room. I'm guilty, planetary scientist, and I'm the science advisor at the Canada Aviation and Space Museum. We're here in Ottawa, National Aviation and Space Museum, and we're part of the Ingenium Corporation. And I'd like to just take a couple of words to launch an opportunity out to you to highlight your technologies in our spaces. I'm going to give you a little intro to the museum and then a couple examples of how we're already doing this. But if you're interested, come and see me later. So our mission as a corporation is to foster scientific and technological literacy throughout the country and to unlock the curious and creative minds of innovators such as yourself, but also the next generation of innovators. So this is what the museum floor looks like. It's basically a giant hangar. We have plenty of aircraft, things like engines, propellers, but we also in 2010 took on the mantle of space, and so we have some wonderful space exhibits as well. And Veronica might have mentioned an MDA technology. Can anyone see an MDA technology that's in this image here? Yell it out. Canadarm! All right, I'm going to come back to that. So we have a variety of really, national treasure artifacts at the museum, which include the Avro Arrow nose. This is the largest surviving piece of the Avro Arrow. We also have the original Twin Otter, de Havilland Twin Otter, built in 1965. This is the aircraft that I used to do all my Arctic geology. And of course, the Beaver, which is the first metal bush plane used and still used very widely today. We also have a variety of space exhibits, things like Canada in Space, where that's Chris Hadfield's Sokol suit that he used on the Soyuz. We have a Life in Orbit exhibit and a Health in Space exhibit. We also do traveling exhibits. This one's called Earth in Focus, Insights from Space, basically an Earth observation exhibit. And I think next week it starts off being an expedition at Thetford Mines in Quebec. But this Earth observation exhibit also highlights a variety of Canadian satellites, including RadarSat, which is another MDA technology. We also are founding partners for CARDMS, which is a Center for Advanced Research and Training in Aviation, Mobility, and Space. This is sort of a new organization or center which is backed by aviation and aerospace industry partners, which all have the goal to create a space for both education and outreach, but also industry to do their business collaboratively. So back to the highlight your tech in our spaces. The museum does more than just exhibitions and artifacts. We also do a lot of outreach, special events, educational programming, and games. And though we do that ourselves, we would love to have partners and collaborations highlight their technologies and use your expertise in association with ours. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of how we're currently doing this. We're currently partnering with Western University, Mission Control, and an organization called STEAM Labs, where we've developed a series of activities, workshops for youth. This one in particular is AI and robotics workshops. One of them, this was basically my desk the other day, is a little Lego rover that some kids have to basically create a mechanism to go and repair a communication satellite. In this example, I've got a little, a little sensor. Ooh. A little sensor on that mechanism. You go and touch the satellite, and then the rover cheers. And so they have to learn how to block code that rover to complete the task. Another example is a partnership with Algonquin College. We're working with them. We've gave them a space in a small theater at the back of the museum where they can develop, students have to develop a game as part of their program. Right now, at their 3rd years, they have to develop a game that is actually market worthy. And so during the game development, they invite our visitors to come and test it out, and they get immediate user feedback, as well as our visitors get to check out what not only test out virtual reality, which many kids have probably done these days, but see what game development is like in the process. And then the students themselves, they're learning soft skills in addition to their game-making things, and the museum is offering a unique experience to our visitors, and so it's a win-win situation. And then finally, an example of a special event. Just before Christmas, Mission Control, which is a AI/software operations company, space company here in Ottawa, we hosted a come and test pilot a rover day at the museum. So they brought in their rover and basically a computer platform where people could come one by one and test drive their rover, the real rover, which is remotely. And you can see me on the side. This is their rover terrain, and it's a little Husky rover that people get to try and test drive, and then they went home with a little I drove a rover card. So just perfect example. And then again, win-win. They get user feedback for the technology that they're developing. They also got to advertise technology that they were sending on a real mission to the moon. If any of those are familiar, probably Ian, was on an ice-based mission, which fortunately did not complete its landing, but we would have had them on the moon. And then that brings me back to MDA. We have long since been partners with MDA and had these long-term loans of some of their legacy technologies, like Canadarm. This is one of 5. This is the Canadarm that was on the shuttle Endeavour. It's a prized possession of both Canadians, MDA, and the museum. And then we also have other technologies that represent the history of MDA. And I'm just going to mention 2, and then I'm going to leave the future of MDA to Ian. But we have the Hermes engineering model. It's a communications satellite from the 70s. Really cool. It just looks like a giant gold satellite. And then my personal newer favorite is Rex, which is a Mars prototype rover, which was designed and built by MDA on behalf of the Canadian Space Agency. And this is actually the first rover I got to work with in the field. So it holds my heartstrings, but it's in the lobby of the museum today. So if you'd like to check out more MDA tech, come and visit us. And if you'd like to collaborate, come and talk to me. And I'm going to thank you again and pass it over to Ian to talk about MDA and Canada's future in space.
So I'm pleased to introduce Ian McLeod, VP Corporate Development for MDA, Canada's largest space company and one of the world's most established space technology innovators. And they're located right here in the Tech Park. We're looking forward to hearing from you, Ian.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Ian McLeod. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Development at MDA. My personal background is I started out at MDA in 1995 as an electrical engineer. At the time, our head office was out in Vancouver, so that was where I started. And I've seen a lot of change in the space industry during my time at MDA. I did leave for a few years and then came back in 2020 to join the corporate office. So I've worked across most of the major areas of MDA and seen some of the change that I'm going to talk about as we go through the presentation. So my presentation is What's Up in Space. This is not going to be a deep dive on technology. I'm probably not qualified to do that anymore. This will be more looking at sort of the 10,000 foot level. What's happening in space right now? How is the market changing? And where's Canada's place in that market? So I'm going to try in this discussion to answer sort of 4 key questions. And each of these questions you could spend an hour on its own. So by necessity, I'm going to be sort of going along at a high level. The first question is, where are we in the space industry? What's going on and sort of how are we situated? I'm going to talk to you about a bunch of growth that's happening in the space industry, and so we'll talk a little bit about what's driving that growth. The third question is, why does it matter, i.e., why should anybody in this room care? And the last is bringing that back to Canada. What's happening in Canada right now, and how does it relate to that bigger picture? So where are we? I'm borrowing this concept from a guy named Chris Quilty. You'll see his logo down in the bottom there. He runs a company that used to be called Quilty Analytics, is now called Quilty Space, because there's so much going on in the space industry that he's chosen to focus his business just on space. And he has the concept of essentially breaking the space journey into 3 major pieces. And so he'll contend that we're in space 3.0 right now, which I think I agree with. So if we kind of look at the breakdown here, you've got the time scale along the bottom there. And we sort of say, let's start thinking about space as an industry with the launch of Sputnik 1 on October 4th, 1957. So there was stuff going on before that, of course, but this was when the first satellite was launched into space by the Soviet Union at the time. And you're in the era of Space 1.0. And what was Space 1.0? That was big government. So the players in that tended to be large governments. In fact, most specifically, the Soviet Union government and the United States government, the superpowers at the time. The types of missions were sort of large, expensive, what I call proof of concept missions. How do we get the first person into space? How do we get the first satellite up? How do we get to the moon? And a lot of the activity was driven by a space race between the Soviet Union and the United States. And we looked at where was funding coming from, where was the money coming from to drive that. It was coming from large governments. Only large governments could afford the expense that was needed to undertake some of these missions. And that started to change. There's not a hard line between Space 1.0 and Space 2.0. You started to see some other countries get involved in space, and in fact, Canada was one of them, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But as we sort of move into what we're calling Space 2.0, what we're seeing there is the costs are starting to come down a little bit, and you're starting to first see some commercial activity in space. It's not just governments doing things. It's commercial actors as well, determining that they can do commercially viable projects in space. And so the players then start to become large and medium-sized governments because others can participate and see a strategic reason to do that, but also large corporations. You see Telesat being stood up in this era here in Canada as a crown corporation. You see similar things happening in the United States and in Europe. You're starting to see the first use of commercial SATCOM, people realizing that they can beam television signals. The first SATCOM constellations, which a lot of people forget about now, what came about in the 1990s. That was Iridium, you may have heard of, Globalstar. These were the early satellite phones. Most of those companies actually went bankrupt, but then they continued on as an operating entity afterwards and still exist today. You start to see the very first commercial Earth observation where people realize that maybe there's a market out there for what was exclusively the purview of government, which is taking pictures of the Earth. Maybe there's commercial applications, and you start to see some companies begin to do that. And really importantly, GPS gets completed in that time frame. And in 1983, the decision is made that GPS will be open to non-military users, which spawns an entire market, which is actually one of the largest markets still in the space market, if not the largest market in the space industry. So in Space 2.0, what you're seeing, it's not just the large governments. You sort of have medium-sized governments playing, and you have large corporations, such as Motorola at the time was an investor in one of those satellite constellations, as an example. And then there's a relatively hard cutoff here where I move from space 2.0 to 3.0, and we'll talk about why 2010 was important when I get into some of the details. But suffice to say, what we've seen in the last decade in space is a dramatic reduction in the cost of accessing space. And that's changed everything. It's changed how companies behave. It's changed how governments behave. It's changed how the whole approach to innovation is done in the space economy. And so if you look at players, now it's any size of government. You look across the world, there's something like 80 or 90 different space agencies now. Rwanda has a space program. Small countries that you wouldn't think of as participating in space are participating in space. Similarly, any size of corporation can now muster the wherewithal to do something in space. And importantly, in red there, you start to see startups appear. A lot of startups appearing in space as they start to come up with ideas that previously would not have had a business case that would close. But now when we're dealing with lower cost of entry, lower barriers, suddenly some of this stuff becomes viable. And the underlying sort of trend is towards commercialization. It's commercial communications, commercial Earth observation, and even commercial space exploration. As was just mentioned, on April 25th, an attempt was made for the first commercial landing on the moon. A company called iSpace out of Japan. They succeeded in launching. They succeeded in getting into orbit around the moon. They succeeded in most of the landing, and unfortunately, right at the end, had a what we call a hard landing, and the spacecraft didn't survive. But here's the thing: that didn't bankrupt the company. They're going to do another mission, and that just speaks to the way the innovation has changed in the space industry. So they learned a ton. And as mentioned, there was a Canadian connection there where there was some Canadian AI software on board that vessel, and there was on that spacecraft, and there was also some sensors from a company called Canadensis here. So all this commercial stuff is going on, and we're also seeing governments change their posture in terms of they don't have to own everything that goes into space. They're actually turning towards being able to and being comfortable with procuring services from assets that corporations may own in space. And the last thing underlying all of this, which is kind of the perfect storm of incentives for growth and a catalyst for growth in the space industry, is a new space race has developed between China and the United States. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. The net result of all this is when you look at where's the money coming from to do some of these initiatives, it's now coming from across the board. It's all sizes of government, it's all sizes of corporations, and importantly, private equity and venture capital have entered the space market as well, which was not traditionally an area where they played. So all of this is happening sort of in the post-2010-ish landscape in the space industry. So one way to sort of visualize what's going on in space is to think about launch, because right now, until we start manufacturing things in space, which by the way is one of the things people are predicting and working on, you still have to launch to get things up into space. So this is a chart that kind of traces back all the way to 1957 with launch activity. And you can see for the longest time through Space 1.0 and Space 2.0, it's dominated by essentially the Americans. It says the West there. That also includes some European launch, but by Russia and the West. And in fact, you can see for a long period of time, it was really Russia that was dominating the launch activity. Per my comment about a new space race emerging, in the red there, you can see China start to get active. And so they started out as just doing a few launches here and there, scattered along this chart. And then you can see that as we get towards 2022 and where we currently stand, they're now doing a significant part of the launching. Previously, and I didn't know this until I saw this chart, the high water mark for launching was actually in 1984. Until recently, that number had not been beat. And now what we see, especially if you look at sort of 2022, 2021, walking back down that scale, you're starting to see an exponential increase in the number of launches that are happening every year. It's growing very rapidly. And importantly, it's also got a strong commercial aspect. There's a lot of launch companies out there who are developing. And that X, for those aren't familiar with the space industry, that is the symbol of SpaceX, Elon Musk's company. And that's marked in there at 2006 was when he first achieved a successful launch. and we'll talk a little bit more about the impact SpaceX has had on the space industry. Second way to look at this is to start looking at the rate of the number of satellites that are up there. And once again, you'll see kind of a similar curve where it's relatively flat for many, many years and then starts to go up quite a bit. And importantly, what also happens is the nature of those satellites starts to change as well. That dotted line is not entirely hypothetical. It's not like just a mathematical formula that's being extended. We'll see on the next slide, there's a lot of missions that are planned, and there's a lot of money that's funding those missions right now, so there's reason to believe that they will be launched. You can see the change in the characteristic of the types of missions. Going back to 2012, where there was about 1,000 satellites in orbit, about 50% of them were in what was called low Earth orbit, which is the orbit closest to us, closest to the Earth's surface. Whereas a full 50% were out further in things like geostationary orbit. That's where you have a satellite that's 36,000 kilometers out, and as a result, it orbits the Earth at the same rate the Earth rotates, and so it appears stationary to us on the ground. That's used for traditional telecommunications like direct-to-home TV, Sirius radio, all those types of applications. And so that reflects, the lingering effects of Space 2.0, where those were sort of the applications. Now, as we move forward in 2021, where there's over 5,000 satellites listed here, and I checked as I was preparing for this, and I think the number is closer to 8,000 or 9,000 now. You're seeing a lot more satellites in low Earth orbit, and the trade-off there is when you move something into low Earth orbit, it's closer, so it's cheaper to get up there. It's easier to get it up there, which is a factor. It also is good for certain applications, like if you want to take pictures of the Earth, the closer you are, the higher the resolution typically you can get. And so there's lots of reasons why to bring satellites closer to the Earth, but it also means that their field of regard is reduced. And that tends to mean you need more of them to accomplish a global mission, which is one of the reasons why you're seeing the number of satellites grow in low Earth orbit. And if you think about what are those satellites doing up there, if you look at the count right now, it's dominated by communications. That's really the focus right now of a lot of the money that's going into the satellite industry. You guys are probably familiar with Starlink. That's a SpaceX Elon Musk product doing internet from space. There's others who are seeking to do that as well. And there's also other various communication type missions that are being developed which require a significant number of satellites to be in low Earth orbit. And if we look at those missions, here are some of the ones that are happening right now. And so right now you have the initial Starlink, which is 3,000 odd satellites that are currently in orbit, more planned. SpaceX has announced they're moving to their next generation. They have a stepping stone called the Gen 2 Modified, which is kind of like a 1.5. They've started launching those. There's 300 odd satellites up there already. They say they're going up to 7,500. But here's the rest. There's a lot of other missions out there that are planned that are currently under construction and happening. They're not all going to happen, far from it. But there's enough there with enough money behind it that a fair number of it will happen. So there will be an increasing number of satellites. And the other thing that happens here is if these missions are successful, and that's a big if, right? These have to enjoy market success to stay around long term. But if they do, the way you add more capacity to those missions is typically to be adding more satellites, to be replenishing the satellites. They only have a certain amount of life. And so this trend will continue so long as there's an economic reason to keep putting these satellites up into orbit. That in turn has captured a bunch of interest from investors. And so as I mentioned, venture capital not typically super active in the space industry. And then once again, as you sort of hit that 2010 timeframe, you start to see a lot more activity. Why is 2010 important? 2010 was when the first successful launch of the Falcon 9 happened. That is the workhorse launch vehicle of SpaceX. So previously in 2006, there were some earlier versions of Falcon that were launched. Falcon 9 was successful in 2010, dramatically lowered the cost of launch, and we'll see what that looks like in a second, and essentially caused a whole bunch of people to pay attention that, hey, wait a minute, I can actually get access to space for a much lower cost. And that's really changed the paradigm of how the space industry is working right now. So punchline at the end is, what does it all mean? Space has become big business. It's about a $460 billion a year enterprise right now. 90% of the spacecraft are commercial now. Like this is a big shift from when it used to be completely government-driven. As I mentioned, there's about 90 nations that have the ability to operate in space or are doing things to become ability to operate in space. 186 launches in 2022. That was the graph we saw previously. And that corresponded in 2022 about 2,500 satellites being launched, which is a significant number of satellites compared to the historical numbers. And that in turn has spawned an ecosystem of companies. So this is some work that's done by Space Tech Analytics. They look at the entire world trying to essentially categorize companies, and so one of their categories is looking at space companies, and they estimate there's about 12,000 space companies globally, about 4,000 individual investors, and you can see also various R&D hubs, et cetera. They try to quantify those as well. On the side of the chart there, you can see the way it's broken out by country. Still very much dominated by the United States, probably about half of the companies in the United States. But still lots of other nations active, and you can see Canada relatively high in the rankings there. So a lot of activity happening in the space ecosystem right now. And it's expected to grow. So it was mentioned by Veronica when I was introduced. Depends who you talk to as to where they see this going. But the consensus is it's sort of north of $1 trillion by 2040. It's interesting because it's a hard thing to estimate, as you can imagine, because there's not a lot of comparables to draw on. I read the City report recently, and they're almost apologetic in a section on the City report saying it's really hard for us to estimate what this is going to look like because we can't compare it to anything else. And the comparison that they said in the report was it's kind of like if you were trying to predict the growth of the internet before the smartphone was invented. You're kind of missing an important piece of the puzzle and how things will develop. And it feels like the early days of the internet where we see things happening, it's going to go places. It's hard to know exactly how to quantify that. But generally, the consensus is it's going to be growing quite substantially over the next several decades. Mission Control Space Services was mentioned. They were the ones who have the software on the attempted landing on the lunar spacecraft. This is a slide that I stole from them. They presented it at the IAC, their CEO, Ewan Reed. I show it because it's kind of another way to think about this trend toward commercialization, and this is very much how MDA thinks about the space industry right now. And in fact, when I talk about some of the things MDA is doing, you'll see how it lines up with this. Telecommunications has been the leader. Telecommunications was the first thing that people realized there was a commercial market for in space and started figuring out how to do that. And it's evolved over time just from the exquisite satellites out in geostationary orbit down to these new systems like Starlink, which has hundreds of satellites or thousands of satellites. It will continue to grow. Earth observation, taking pictures of the Earth, came along later. And it's starting to mature, and you can see Ewan put the same sort of spot that I said, sort of in the 90s when this all started. Canada was involved then. RadarSat 1, which was the first synthetic aperture radar launched by Canada into space. The Canadian Space Agency, to their great credit, had the foresight to say this could be a commercial market. And so they actually went to the effort under that program of setting up a commercial arm that MDA participated in. And became the first company, the first country with a commercial synthetic aperture radar in orbit actually selling imagery from it. And for those who don't know what synthetic aperture radar is, if you go onto Google Earth and you see a picture of your house from the satellite image, that's an optical image. That's taken by effectively the equivalent of a camera in space. And of course, it depends on the fact that the sun is shining and that there's no cloud cover over your house so they can get the picture. Radar doesn't depend on that stuff. Radar is essentially an active sensor where you're beaming down radar energy and then you're listening back to what comes back and you create an image based on that. And the advantage of that is you don't care about whether it's sunny or not, and you don't care whether there's clouds because the microwave energy passes through the clouds. So you can get imagery at any time of day regardless of weather conditions. Canada is a pioneer in that. Canada has a lot of capability there, and we were the first one to launch a commercial mission with RadarSat 1. So what's driving this growth? We've already kind of alluded to it, but I'll build on it. The first and foremost is the lower launch cost to get to space, and I'll show you a chart in a second on what that means. But effectively, when SpaceX came along and sort of re-engineered how a rocket was built and how you get to space and started pioneering things like reusability, so you guys may have seen, the videos where the rocket launches up and then the first stage comes back and lands on a launch pad. Like, this is unheard of stuff that wasn't done before. So the cost per launch starts to come down, but the other thing that's happening is the capability per kilogram, as I call it here, starts to go up. We all know that our smartphones have more computing power than, say, the entire Apollo mission had. That's happening in satellites. And the two things are a virtuous circle. And what I mean by that is the following. When it was really, really expensive to send things into orbit, you had to really, really make sure it was going to work when it got there because you couldn't afford to do it again. It couldn't afford to fail. And that meant you over-engineered it like crazy. It meant you dialed back the technology to make it super, super, super reliable, and you tested and tested and tested. Now, if the cost to launch is cheaper, I'm not going to bankrupt the company if it doesn't work the first time. I can now spend less on the testing, and I can use more advanced technology, and I can pack more capability into the satellite, which means I can do more if I am successful. And so what you're seeing is sort of this importation of Silicon Valley type approach to the space industry that didn't exist before. What's my minimum viable product? What's the minimum thing I have to pull together to be able to prove my business case? And I'm going to fail fast. Get it up there. If it fails, so what? I'll do it again. And how do I measure my product market fit? And how do I get to a point where I can show that I have this capability and a business case that's going to close? And this is happening now in the space industry, whereas before it never happened before. And I'll give you a couple more examples of that as we go through. Feeding, those two trends are sort of the underlying economic engine, feeding a bunch of trends that sit below it in this chart. So more civil spending. That's all those countries saying, hey, I can participate in space now. It's not just the United States. It's not just France. I can have a space program as well. And I want to have a space program because I can see some of the benefits that these nations are getting, and I should have those as well. More commercial. We've talked about that. If you're now seeing business cases that will close that couldn't before, now I'm going to attract investors, and I'm going to have more activity. The defense one is a little more tenuous. Defense will spend what defense will spend if they see a strategic advantage, and really that is driven by the power competition between China and the United States. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, you're seeing the amount of defense activity also following some of these commercial trends because they can also do things cheaper. And they're looking for strategic reasons to change the way that they do things, to get things up faster, to be more resilient, and to deal with the strategic threat that they see from other countries acting in space. And we'll talk about that in a second. So this I wanted to show just to give, this is Chris Quilty again putting this together. This is showing sort of that trend in launch. So for the longest time, launch more or less stayed flat. There's new generations of vehicles, et cetera, but the cost really wasn't coming down very much. It's sort of $10,000 to $15,000 per kilogram to get something into space. And then SpaceX came along, and with the Falcon 9, and then continuing to refine that, introducing more reusability, moving to larger rockets, so the Falcon Heavy is there. Now what you have is the ability to drop that cost per kilogram. And one of the things you see as well is mass launches. And so now instead of one rocket, one satellite, you've got one rocket going on and it's got 60 or 70 satellites on it because it can carry that many and it's deploying them out. It could be a constellation or it could be a whole bunch of different missions which ride share together to go up to space. From the point of view of the people on that mission, doesn't matter. I still get to space and my cost is reduced because I'm taking the bus as opposed to hiring a taxi to go to space. And Starship, which is the thing some of you may have seen blow up on April 20th as they tried their first orbital launch, its promise is to drive that down even further to an estimated sort of $100 per kilogram to get something into space. If they're successful at that, that changes everything. Like you've moved down another order of magnitude in terms of the cost to get things into space. And to illustrate how things are different now in space, it blew up. They're going to launch another one in a few months. They knew it was going to blow up. It wasn't necessarily going to be successful, so they got another one coming down the pipe to be launched. And they're just doing this to learn, to essentially improve how quickly they can innovate and get things into space. And they'd already blown up about 6 of them in suborbital tests previously. So this is a different way of doing things. I don't think anyone could imagine NASA blowing up six rockets just to try to get the rocket technology right. But that's how things are being done at SpaceX. And so it hasn't hurt the space industry either that you have some very high-profile people involved in the space industry. So we've mentioned SpaceX numerous times, and I would say by far they've been the most successful disruptor in the industry. With the things they're doing on launch, with the things they've won some major NASA contracts because they're able to bid more aggressively because they're already building some of the capability. Starlink is, providing internet from space. Behind that, though, you have Jeff Bezos, who you may have seen flew up into space about a year ago. He's got Blue Origin, which is his space company. They also have built launch capability and have had some success doing launch. Within Amazon, which is, of course, his main company, there's a project called Project Kuiper. And Project Kuiper is a competition for Starlink. It's another internet from space type system, which, again, you probably didn't pick it out on the chart that I flashed up with all the hundreds of satellites to be launched, but Kuiper was in there launching thousands of satellites. And then you have Richard Branson, who's also flew up to space. I think he was having a little competition with Bezos to see who would get there first. He has 2 space companies. One is Virgin Galactic, which is his space tourism company, and that was what he flew up to space on. The other is Virgin Orbit, which unfortunately actually just went bankrupt, so it shows you're not always going to be successful in your space ventures, even if you're Richard Branson. So that was his launch company, which essentially launched by launching a rocket from underneath a 747. So you'd fly the 747 up to altitude, clear most of the atmosphere, and then you could use a smaller rocket to get the rest of the way up into space. Unfortunately, they had technical and commercial challenges, which caused them to declare bankruptcy. So I guess the moral of the story is if you want to be successful in the launch industry, you need to have cool aviator sunglasses or you're not going to get there. So that's the takeaway. The new space race. So again, back to drivers of growth. China has been consistently hitting milestones over the last 20 years as they develop their space program. 2003, they put a man in space. They've gone to the moon. They've landed things on the moon successfully, including landing on the far side of the moon, which nobody else had done before. They've built a space station. So you have the International Space Station. There's now a Chinese space station that's manned currently and is being built out. They're doing all kinds of interesting things in space. They have their own GPS system. They've completely launched their own constellation so that they have independent navigation. There are things going on with the powers in space, which is very interesting, with people checking out other people's satellites and having close approaches that people weren't expecting to other people's satellites, which is causing a whole bunch of angst and concern among allies around the behavior of the Chinese in space, including they've blown things up out of space. All the major nations have done that. The United States has done it. Russia has done it. Chinese have now done it, shown that they can blow up a satellite by firing a missile from Earth. Really, really, really bad idea, because you create a huge debris field, which is dangerous for all the other satellites in that orbit, but they've all demonstrated they can do it. And so this is causing a space race where the U.S. essentially is looking to stay ahead of the curve in terms of their capability with vis-a-vis the Chinese, and they're bringing their allies in to help with that. And the Chinese is China is very focused on continuing to grow their space capability. Both kind of view it as the ultimate high ground, and there's parallels here with when Air Forces started to develop. And people realized, okay, this is a serious thing. This is a strategic advantage to be in control of the sky. It's a strategic advantage to be in control of space and to make sure you can operate in space unencumbered. So that is going on as well right now. Why does it matter? Why should anybody care? This could be a whole 1.5 hour talk on its own. I'm going to do it in 2 slides just to give you a top level view of why you should care. The first is that space touches you every day. A lot of people don't realize that, but it touches you in a lot of different ways. There's the obvious way that if you navigated to get to this talk tonight, you might have used your phone GPS, and that's using GPS the navigation satellites to navigate. If you happen to watch TV, you may be getting a signal that's beamed off of a satellite. If you listen to Sirius XM, you're listening to a satellite broadcast. But there's other less obvious ways as well, that if you're eating fruits and vegetables, those fruits and vegetables may have been grown using precision farming techniques that use space assets in order to do that. If you are using Google Maps and you look on the satellite image to see what's going, what does the layout of this area look like, that's again another application of space. If you're doing banking transactions that require very precise timing, that's an application of space. So you should care because this will ultimately touch you. It will also ultimately affect your lives. Space is connecting the world. We've talked about Starlink and the list of missions out there. It's becoming increasingly clear that as you are using your devices, everyone expects to be connected all the time now, as there are still lots of places in the world that are not connected. And I'll have a slide in 1 second that shows direct-to-device and what's going on in that area. But suffice to say, there's a lot of work going on in connecting everybody, and satellites play a role in that. Space is crucial for sustainability and economic prosperity. Back to my example about agriculture, John Deere has an RFP on the street wanting to have space connectivity for their tractors because their tractors are more and more sophisticated and they operate in areas that don't always have cell coverage, and they need to be able to communicate with them to upload software, to drive the vehicles. Some of the vehicles are now becoming autonomous, so they're not actually, there's no farmer sitting in the vehicle. All this needs connectivity, and so they're looking to get a strategic advantage by having connectivity. So anything that involves sort of large-scale applications, and we think about climate change, the ability to monitor climate change. There's a company in Montreal called GHGSat, which produced the very first methane monitoring satellites. We'll talk about that in a second. And so that's obviously important if you're going to try to control the amount of greenhouse gases you're emitting. Then being able to measure that is obviously a pretty important thing. Things like the radar satellites that I talked about, their ability to monitor the Arctic and see what's going on with the ice caps. How large are they receding, et cetera. That's all measured from space. So if you have a global challenge, being able to step back and see that from space is a pretty big advantage. Space is critical to national security. I won't talk further on that one. We just discussed it. And it's going to become more and more commercial. That's the trend. That's kind of my message here today, is it's becoming more commercial. And so for people in this room who are involved in tech and understand sort of commercial business, there's opportunity here because things are trending in that direction. Direct to device. This is a hot topic right now, so I put one slide in just to talk about it. Apple was first out of the gate. Apple announcing that they were contracting Globalstar to provide a service to them to allow the iPhone 14 to connect directly to satellites. Right now, it's limited to just being for emergency services. So if you're out hiking and you have no connectivity, you can point your phone at the sky and connect to a satellite. That's going to grow. There's going to be more stuff you can do. Interesting story on that one. That has a Canadian connection. MDA won the contract to build the next generation of satellites for Globalstar with the backing of Apple. And so when you get to the iPhone, whatever, 15, 16, whatever it'll be, and you point your phone to the sky, you're probably going to be talking to Canadian technology on the other end built by MDA. So really neat stuff happening in that whole space. But Apple's not alone. They were just the first mover. So others are also developing the ability to connect directly to satellites from your handheld. And in fact, just a week ago, I think it was last week, Rogers announced that they'd done a deal with Starlink to provide a service to Canadian cell phones, direct link to cell phones. So you have this really interesting dynamic happening, by the way, between the telcos, who are kind of trying to get access to the technology, and then you've got Apple, who's a device builder. They're doing their own thing. Do they still have to go through the telcos? Or are they going direct to their own satellites? That's all going to be played out in the future. But the one thing that I can tell you will happen is it will move from beyond just being search and rescue to more sort of routine services directly from your phone. With the big vision being, of course, that you eventually get to a point where you don't really care where the cell towers are anymore because you can reach a communication hub regardless of where you are. Lots of technical challenges here, by the way, but that's where the trend's going. So let's bring it all back to Canada as I wrap up here. So what's happening in Canada? And by the way, because this was an area that I worked in for many years, I have to point out that this is a RadarSat-1 mosaic of Canada. So this is that radar imagery I was telling you about. This doesn't depend on sunlight. It was taken thousands and thousands of images from RadarSat-1. That's radar reflectivity of Canada turned into a map. And it essentially shows the technology that Canada is well known for internationally on a map of Canada. So Canada has done a lot of stuff in space that a lot of people don't really know about. So I wanted to take one slide just to sort of highlight the history here. This is not exhaustive. I had to fit it onto one slide. So I just tried to hit some of the ones that maybe people have heard about before. A lot of people don't know that in 1962, with the launch of Alouette 1, Canada became the third country to actually have our own satellite in space. It was launched first by the Americans, but we built it here in Canada. So when we talked about sort of the big space powers, Canada was actually in there at the start during Space 1.0, starting to launch satellites. And it's not hard to see why we would do that. With a country as large as ours, things like communication, Earth observation, all that stuff matters because we have an enormous country to monitor and attend to. In 1972, Anik A1, first domestic comm satellite. So this is the first satellite that went up purely for providing domestic communications. That was around the time Telesat, as I said, was created. 1981, first space robotics, the Canadarm, which we all know. So Canadarm was launched in 1981 on the shuttle mission. Canadarm1 was on the shuttle. Canadarm2 is on the International Space Station, and I'll talk in a second about Canadarm3, which we're currently building. 1984, Marc Renault becomes the first Canadian in space on a shuttle mission. And by the way, that's not an accident that it happens just after the Canadarm is provided, because that's the way space exploration works. Countries come together, they contribute technology, and in return they get exploration rides. We'll talk a second about Jeremy Hansen. That's directly tied to Canadarm3. 1993, first satellite servicing with robotics. So this is an area people talk about servicing satellites in space. And in fact, there's been a couple demonstration missions that have already been done. But if you go back, it was actually the Canadarm, which was the first robotics. Remember when Hubble was launched, it didn't work at first. And so they sent a shuttle up. The arm caught Hubble, brought it in, they fixed it, and then re-released it again. So that was the first example of robotics being used for in-orbit satellite servicing. RadarSat-1 we've talked about, the first commercial synthetic aperture radar mission. And this was GHGSat 2016. I kind of jumped there, but I wanted to get them in because I think it's significant. First commercial satellite, which could measure greenhouse gases high resolution, and it was built by GHGSat based out of Montreal. And so they got a lot of press recently when some of the COP conferences were happening, because they are essentially providing measurements that allow people to understand what's going on with greenhouse gases. Moving to more recent stuff, and I tried to mix in here some space exploration type stuff along with some commercial activity, just to give you a sense of sort of the scope of things going on. So in 2019, Canada announced it would join the NASA Artemis mission. That's the trip to the moon. And our contribution would be Canadarm3. And Canadarm3 will be the robotics that go on the Lunar Gateway, which will be the station that will be orbiting the moon. On the commercial side, 2021, MDA went public. We raised about $400 million. So lots of interest in MDA in the space industry. Space Canada, which is the industry association for space in Canada, was founded in 2022 by 9 companies, now has over 50 members. So lots of interest and lots of excitement around Space Canada. I'll have a couple things about them in a second. We mentioned MDA wins a $450 million Global Star constellation to support Apple's direct-to-device. North Star, a company out of Montreal, which is focused on space domain awareness. They're focused on launching a constellation which is going to take pictures of other things in space. Because there's so much stuff up there now, you need to start keeping track of it as to what it is and who owns it and where is it going. And so they're working on a constellation. They raised $35 million in Series C. By the way, space was not immune to the tech downturn, where it's become harder to raise money. But here, this was in January of this year. They raised their $35 million, so we're seeing companies be successful in raising funds, even in this environment. Just a month ago, it was announced that Jeremy Hansen would be joining the Artemis 2 mission, which will be going out around the moon as one of the test phases in terms of getting people to the moon again under the Artemis program. This group, who was actually just here in Ottawa a few days ago, will go farther into space than any other human being has ever been before. They're going to go well past the moon and do a loop around it. Jeremy is on that mission because Canada is contributing the Canadarm3 technology. And so NASA says thank you. As part of the payment for that, we'll give you a ride for one or more of your astronauts. So it's sort of a pay-to-play type of environment when you're on these big exploration missions. Want to highlight Kepler Communications. They're based in Toronto. They're focused on space communications. This was just 2 weeks ago they announced they raised $92 million in their Series C round. So again, more funding coming in. They're focused on building a constellation of satellites that allow satellites that are in orbit to essentially communicate through them to get to ground from anywhere in the orbit without needing a ground station nearby. Some neat technology being done in Toronto, and I mentioned the Rogers deal at the bottom there. That's Space Canada's membership. Not all of the membership, just a scattering of the companies. Like I said, there's 50 members now. I wanted to do a shout out for Space Canada. MDA is obviously one of the founding members. If you want to learn more about what's going on in the space industry, there's actually a conference happening May 9th next week here in Ottawa. It's called Horizons, and it'll be industry and government essentially presenting their future plans and what they're doing over the next several years. And if you want to get even more in depth, there's the Spacebound Conference, which happens in October with Space Canada, where you can come and participate and learn everything that's going on in space. That's a broader conference over several days talking about all things space in Canada and internationally. I'm from MDA, so I had to have one slide talking about what we're doing at MDA. I won't be long on this. But remember the slide where it talked about the waves of how things are maturing? We're sort of centered on those waves. So communications, our satellite systems group is building the next generation of direct-to-device for Apple. For Earth observation, which you guys remember matured next, our geointelligence group is focused on that, primarily in the area of radar imaging. We are building what's called Chorus, which is the next generation of RadarSat mission. It'll be the 4th generation. It's actually a constellation combining multiple satellites. It's being done 100% commercial. So we've seen it move from RadarSat 1, which was a government mission. RadarSat 2 was a public-private partnership. Chorus that's being developed now will be a pure commercial mission that MDA is developing. So you've seen that sort of transition happen. And then in space operations, focused on Canadarm3. We're building Canadarm3 for that gateway we just discussed. But because there's so much other activity happening around mining on the moon, mining asteroids, servicing satellites, doing all these things that people want to do under about space infrastructure. And I forgot to mention in Ewan's chart, you'll notice I crossed out exploration and said infrastructure because it's broader than just exploration. And that's what our robotics and space operations group in Brampton is doing. Importantly, they're going to take the technology from Canadarm3 and they're going to commercialize it. And we've already had our first sale to one of the entities that's working on a commercial space station called Axiom. So they're going to be using the Canadian robotics as part of their development of that station. Last thing for you guys, if you're interested in this and want to read and understand more, I'd recommend this article. It came from the Harvard Business Review. Your company needs a space strategy now. And it's really just recapping everything I just talked about the trend, how things are changing. But more importantly, they do a bunch of work there trying to talk about how it will impact business in the future. The link is there at the bottom. I don't know if these slides are going to be shared, but you can always go there to learn more. That's it. I hope I didn't go too far over time.